And Susan's going to introduce tonight's speaker. Here you go. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Susan.
Pause 1 second. She's got to turn on the record. It should be. Is it recorded? It says this meeting is being recorded. Okay, all right, we're good. Thanks. Okay.
Hi, my name is Susan Van Burl, and I am here to introduce our speaker, Andy Scott. Let's see here. In 2017, Andy changed careers from a graphic designer to pursue his passion for nature and gardening. He used his own yard to understand what would grow well in an urban area and what would work well for pollinators. And he's trying to develop wildlife-friendly gardens. His company, ReWild Gardens, specializes in utilizing native plants and wildlife-friendly practices to support insects, birds, other wildlife while creating healthy soil and conserving water. And he likes to involve his clients in all aspects of the process and helps provide resources to learn about and demystify the plant-pollinator relationships that their landscapes will be supporting. ReWild provides planning. Everybody take notes of what you want to hire for: planning, installation and maintenance services for new and established wildlife-friendly urban gardens. Earlier this year, I hired ReWild to come in and help prune a bunch of my young trees because I wasn't sure. I read the books, but when it came to cutting those limbs, there was this little twinge of, am I doing the right thing? Or somebody else has had this feeling, right? Where there's 3 leads and you're trying to figure out which ones to cut off and which ones to keep. So I had him come in and ReWild come in with, I want to say Becky, that's Rachel, with Rachel. And we walked around from tree to tree to tree to tree and talked about what we would do on each of them. And I got to watch how the pruning went so that next year I'll feel more confident to get in there on my own. So if you have some project you're just not quite sure of and you want a little bit of help, that would be my suggestion. I plan to hire them again as soon as I confuse myself. So now here's Andy Scott.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Susan. That's very kind of you. So I'm glad we made a good impression. So let's get into it here. We have got quite a bit of material to get through. I think I'm just clicking now. So here's just an overview of what we'll try to get through. So for some of you, this might be stuff you already know. Hopefully there's some things in here for some of you more experienced native plant landscapers. There might be something in there to take away. But if you're looking to just get a really good sort of start on native landscaping or kind of get a foot in the door on it, hopefully this will give you a good start there. So we'll do a bit of an introduction on why I think you should plant natives in your landscape and why I think you should be doing instilling pollinator-friendly practices. I really want to spend some time looking at resources because I feel like a lot of times in my presentations, resources kind of get pushed to the end. And then people are asking me about handouts and where they can find stuff. So I want to spend some time really talking about resources and really looking at those because I think they're really valuable for getting a start. We'll look at kind of just general habitat gardening how-tos, talk about Douglas Tallaming a little bit. We'll look at maintenance and management again at the forefront because I think those are something that people really don't get a good handle on how to maintain and manage these things long term. That's kind of where a lot of shortcomings come. We'll look at some different types of gardens that we've done work on, some site preparation, design tips. If we have time, we'll look at some recommended plants, but I think at that point we might be a little tight. So because I want to make sure we leave some time for questions and answers. So quick background on me. Susan did a pretty good job. This is me surrounded by, doesn't look like that many in the photo, but probably about 300 to 400 hostas that we pulled out of a garden. So I'm not anti-hosta. It's just that sometimes we got to refine that balance, right? So a few hostas, that's fine. That many hostas, you know, we can do better. So that's what we're up to now is basically just taking out hostas apparently, but We're doing lots of different things, rain gardens, prairie installations, doing things from seed, doing things from, other site preparation methods too. Been doing it since 2017. I live in Bloomington. We operate out of Bloomington. I'm a member of Wild Ones. I feel strongly that Wild Ones is a really good organization. The resources are amazing, good support system here too. I'm also on the Bloomington Sustainability Commission working on natural resources with them, and I'm proud to live in Bloomington. So why native plants? I'm gonna try to slow down a little bit. I know I'm probably talking a little fast. So first off, habitat loss and fragmentation. We see this a lot. I mean, you drive 25 minutes at any direction out of the city and you see the development happening. We see it everywhere around us. We're filling in wetlands. Grasslands are decreasing quite a bit. We see what previously were like tree farms turning into big developments as well. So we're seeing it happen, and some statistics are less than 4% of native U.S. tallgrass prairie is remaining. And there's speculation that 70% of all U.S. grasslands may be gone by 2100. So like I said, we see it happening. We can offset that in our own landscapes. The extinction crisis, again, we're seeing this. We don't see fireflies anymore. We don't see as many Lepidoptera, which are moths and butterflies, around anymore. So we're encountering 35% fewer Lepidoptera and 50% fewer birds than 40 years ago. 230 North American bird species are at risk of extinction within decades. 96% of songbirds feed only insects to their young. And Douglas Talmy is the one who's done a lot of research specifically on chickadees, that they need 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars to rear one clutch of chicks. So again, a lot of you may know that, but if you're new to this kind of idea, definitely look into that study and read Bringing Nature Home. And it'll really help you understand just what birds need to really feed their young. Bird feeders are great. Fruiting shrubs and trees are great, but they really need that protein to feed those babies. Excuse me. Of our insects, 90% of insects who feed on plants are specialists. So they need specific plants to feed on. So we're thinking like monarchs and milkweed. They need a particular plant to raise their young. So any insect that's, a lot of those insects need that. Roughly 30% of our native bee population are pollen specialists. So our native bees need specific plants that they co-evolve with to get really good, nectar and pollen sources. So invasive species and plant diversity. So our natural areas are under a lot of pressure from climate change, from development, all sorts of things. So the less diversity we have in our natural areas, the less that we really have in general. So our landscapes can help offset that. 30% of our plants in our natural areas are invasive plants. There are over 3,400 species of invasive plants in this country. 80% of what is planted in our suburban areas is not locally native. So you see this with the garden centers. I think Japanese barberry is now not being sold anymore, which is really great to see. And I believe burning bush might be on its way out, if not already too. So, we keep adding more and more non-native species and things get way out of whack. So these are those resources I mentioned. So Bringing Nature Home, it's a must read for anybody that wants to learn more about native planting. Douglas Talmy has a hub too that we'll look at in a second here, an online hub. Minnesota Wildflowers.info is an invaluable resource, indexing and cataloging all of Minnesota's plants, native and non-native. So if you have invasive species in your yard and you want to learn more about what those are to identify them, that's a really helpful resource. Heather Holmes' books. So Heather Holmes is an entomologist and landscape professional, and so she's written books on pollinators, so native bees. Most recent one was on wasps, which is really, really valuable to kind of demystify wasps and learn that they're not that, they're not terrible things. And Benjamin Vogt, for sure, if you're looking at really thinking how we need to re-envision our landscapes and rework those connections with cities and municipalities and neighbors, to try to re-envision what our yards need to look like. Any of Benjamin Vogt's books are really, really good to read too. Organizations, Wild Ones, of course, Xerxes Society, focusing on pollinator health, especially with like farmers and that sort of thing. Neighborhood Greening is a local organization in St. Paul run by Leslie Pilgrim, who's a Wild Ones member, connecting neighborhoods together. Altlawns.org is a Richfield, Bloomington group that is working on helping people learn how to do alternative lawns that are more resilient, that also feature native plants. Blue Thumb has really great resources on rain gardens and all sorts of water quality things. And if you are in 9 Mile Water Creek watershed or within Dakota County Soil and Water, they have grants that you can apply for that will help you get some of these in your properties as well. So this is Talame's Hub. So you can go to homegrownnationalpark.com and you can have access to his books, articles, interviews, podcasts, all that sort of thing. You can also register your own garden to try to add to this homegrown national park idea and get a sign that helps neighbors kind of interpret your planting. Prairie Moon Nursery is a really valuable tool for planting your gardens. It's a good source of local native plant stock. So these are all seed and plant stock that is genetically ecotyped to Minnesota. So it's stuff that should be here. But what I like them for is their sorting function on the left-hand side here. So if you're planting a garden and want to know what a good plant that gets 2 feet tall, blooms in June, and is good for medium wet soils, this sorting tool on the left here is really, really helpful. So if nothing else, it's a really good resource that way. And you can buy your plants at the same time. Minnesota Wildflowers, this is the site that I mentioned for plant identification. So if you go up here to advanced plant search, they've got all these different categories that you can basically be your own kind of botanist and look at leaf shape, leaf structure, whether it's tooth leaf or there's hairs on it, or or if the leaves are alternate or opposite, and you can identify that plant really easily. So it's a really good way to learn what's in your landscape and not just have someone tell you what it is. So I don't want to, shame anybody or whatever, but I do like to have some do's and don'ts when we're talking about creating habitat. So we do want to plant diverse native host plants. So those are going to be plants that are fostering beneficial insects. We want to utilize pollinator-friendly maintenance practices. So you think about things like leave the leaves, no mow May, things like that. One note on no mow May is you want to be careful in that it really only works for an already sort of established healthy planting. So if you have a really stressed lawn that's mostly weeds and thistle and dandelion, and you do a no mow May, you're going to just be spreading weeds around your neighborhood. So it's really something that's been developed for meadows and bee lawns, things like that. So really make sure that if you're going to do no mow May, that you're putting it in a good light and not just having a dandelion patch that's going to blow into the neighborhood and blow into other people's native gardens too. I don't want dandelions in my garden. So something to keep in mind there. You do want to create a variety of environments. So our native bees like all sorts of different places that they can nest. So bare soils, hollow stems, decaying logs. For birds, evergreen trees and water sources are really important. We're not using any pesticides or herbicides, and we're not using cultivars or nativars of plants. We're just sticking with straight species plants. Those are if we're planting for nature, nature wants those plants. They don't want the double flowering pom-pom wildberry echinacea or whatever they're offering. So plant those in a little thing for yourself, but don't plant that for nature. And one thing that I kind of tell people is that just planting natives in your garden really isn't enough. You can put as much echinacea in your garden as you want, but if you're not instilling those pollinator-friendly practices, then you're not quite going far enough for that nature. So, and this is kind of what gardening for wildlife really kind of boils down to sometimes, is that this liacheous plant is not just acting as a nectar plant for monarchs; it's also acting as a seed. It's feeding this finch, it's potentially acting as a host plant. So you don't want any single-use plants in your garden. You want a plant that's going to be hitting a bunch of different sort of spots as far as being beneficial to wildlife. So your garden should function as a beautiful space for you to enjoy, but we also want it to, create natural habitat. Plants are offering more than just forage. They're offering seeds, nectar, and pollen, but also acting as host plants. Often supporting multiple animal species. So think about like mammals, birds, and bugs. And we're also addressing habitat fragmentation. So we're connecting the dots between natural areas. So if you think about like the Minnesota River Valley, being a natural area, and you've got, another park that's 5 miles away, right? How are populations of organisms getting from that area to another natural area without having to go through impermeable surfaces like pavement and streets, or really poor areas that are compacted soils? So if we have no nature to connect those dots, species diversity suffer. So if our yards can become those corridors, that's really the goal. So this is a graphic from a book that I also recommend called Noah's Garden by Sarah Stein. So what we're looking at here is, this is like your lots. This is like your property. Your house is here, A. If we can, this is your lawn, C, that's your, you know, the space you're going to be using. If we can devote like the back third of our property, like if every property in a neighborhood devoted the back third of their area to being like a natural corridor that's untouched, it's not being mowed, it's not being whacked down, it's being managed for invasive. So we're going in maybe once a year and just managing buckthorn, managing things like that. If you connect those and tessellate them like this, then you have this nice corridor. This could be your alleyway, this could be your, you know, your back fence row. But if every kind of house had that, then you can see where we start to really connect those dots. And if there's a park here and there's a nature preserve here, then you can see how that wildlife can really start to really physically move through a space. So this is actually taken from one of Douglas Tallamy's, adapted from one of his presentations. I really thought it was a good representation of what we look at traditionally with landscape, right? So if you hire a typical landscaper, your main emphasis is going to be on decorative value. You're going to look at, you know, really functional things like screening. So screening out mechanicals, screening out certain things for privacy. You want a nice focal point in your garden, like a fountain or something, or a specimen tree. And the garden's function is to anchor your landscape, anchor your house. What that creates is an unbalanced system. So there's no room in there for nature. Nature's not really able to function in that kind of a scenario. So what we want to see is we want to balance that out with some of these other things here. So a native landscape or a naturalized landscape, it's going to be sequestering carbon. You know, you've got deep-rooted plants, you've got lots of trees and shrubs that are holding carbon, they're growing, they're putting that back in the soil. They're adding to watershed value and weather moderation because they're holding soil. We've got really, you know, drought-tolerant plants that are, you know, not letting dust billow away during a windstorm when it's a drought. We've got soil restoration as part of that. That creates pollinator habitat. Wildlife appreciation comes naturally with that too, because the birds and the bees and the butterflies come when we do those sorts of things. And along with that is the food web value. And that's kind of that, you know, invisible ecosystem service that we kind of take for granted, but that's a really important part of it too. And they can absolutely live in harmony. We absolutely can, you know, have that decorative value, have those really, you know, pragmatic aspects of landscape while still, you know, supporting nature. So when we talk about, you know, oh, I want a native landscape and I want a butterfly garden, this is typically, I think, what people are really excited about is like, I want to see swallowtails and monarchs and hummingbirds and I want beautiful blooming plants that are, you know, never going to need water ever. And that's, you know, partially, you know, like, yes, they're more drought resistant. That's partially true. And you're going to see some of these things. You're going to see beautiful butterflies and things like that. But what you're probably going to see a lot of is this too. This is a plant that is not under attack. It's not being, you know, destroyed. It is currently hosting larvae for the painted lady butterfly. So this is Pearly Everlasting. It's a native wildflower. And every one of these little kind of crumpled up spots here is a larvae that is kind of hanging out inside this leaf, munching away. And when they emerge, then they turn into these painted lady butterflies. Believe it or not, but when they're done eating this plant, the plant responds pretty well, given, you know, normal moisture levels. The plant will respond pretty well, flush back and bloom and be totally fine. So that's what we talk about with that balance, right? So these aren't Japanese beetles coming into your garden and destroying your shrubs, and then the shrubs never come back again. This is a system where this organism has evolved with this plant, and the plant bounces back. So again, same for red admirals. Red admirals are hosting on primarily, I think, nettles. So this is Pennsylvania pellitory, which is in the nettle family. It's a very common weed. You probably all have it in your homes. It's like a foundation weed. Some people call it smart weed or easy weed. It is a native plant. It's not a very beautiful native plant, but red admiral caterpillars love hosting on Pennsylvania pellitory. So when we go in and remove all the Pennsylvania pellitory out of our landscapes because they're ugly, we're removing a lot of host plant for these insects. So, you know, I wouldn't say maybe leave it in the top front border of your garden, but if you have space towards the back, it's nice to leave a little bit for them back there. Of course, monarchs and milkweed. This is Sullivan's milkweed. It's a really fleshy, slightly moisture-loving milkweed, but similar to common milkweed. But you can see, I think this was just a few years back, how many different monarch caterpillars are on that. So again, kind of the good with the bad, right? And these aren't bad at all. But wasps and hornets, they get a really bad rap, and spiders do too. This is a golden digger wasp, I believe. I believe my ID is right on that. And they're solitary wasps. They're not forming big, big nests that they're defending aggressively. They're going through and they're picking off larvae and little soft-bellied insects out of your garden. To go feed, and potentially grasshoppers, things like that, to go feed their young. So they're kind of your pest control. They're patrolling your garden for those pests, and they're also pollinating too. They're pollinating plants. This is I'm not sure what species this is, but the reason I like this image is because it's eating a little grub. So they're even the hornets that are aggressive. I wouldn't want one over my back door, but if they're in the right spot, and you can leave them be, they're doing a good job of things. And of course, spiders, you either love them or you hate them, but they're really beneficial. They're really great bird food too. So birds love eating spiders. This one was actually at our cabin, and this spider was probably about 1.5 inches long. And this cluster of eggs was right below them. And that cluster of eggs was probably about 2 inches across. It was pretty gnarly, pretty cool. But I got to see him hatch. And then, you've got other guys into here. There's an herbivore, there's the katydid, and then you've got, the assassin bug, which is going and eating little grubs and things like that too, sucking all the moisture out of those soft-bellied insects. So, so you see all these like beneficial insects like lacewings and, things like that too, that will come back in. So, and then you can't forget about like the, cute and fuzzies either. So of course we all love our birds, and the birds will follow that insect life. So as soon as you get really healthy insects, life in your garden, you'll see those birds come. And then, who doesn't love a bumblebee? So I want to talk at length, as much length as I can, about maintenance and management. Because like I said, it's something that I think gets left behind a lot. And when I first started, working with native plants, native landscapes were really touted as like they're no maintenance. You plant them and they take care of themselves, and it's it's all fine. And I'm not sure where that originated. It was a very commonly believed thing though. But what we learned is that is not the case, right? So any garden is going to need aftercare, maintenance, upkeep, things like that. Certain species are more aggressive than others. As I mentioned, we have a lot more invasive species that are moving in. So you've got birds constantly depositing seeds in your garden of buckthorn and mulberry and all these kinds of things. Things can go sideways really fast, especially if the system is out of balance. So, so some tips to kind of, think about maintaining. For weeds, identification is really important. So knowing what kind of weeds are in there. Maybe the weed you think is the weed isn't really that big of a deal. Maybe it's Pennsylvania pellitory and you can just leave it. But identifying it will help you, discover the best way to handle it. Prioritize if you have a couple different things, if you've got thistle and you've got something else going on in there, prioritizing the worst first, and then, kind of going and strategizing from that point on. And again, using Minnesota Wildflowers or, University of Minnesota Extension can be really helpful in identifying those weeds and learning how to manage them. Monthly attention, any new planting for sure. If you have a brand new planting, it's going to need at least monthly attention, probably more. Because a new planting, a young planting has lots of open space, and the more open space you have in there, the more weeds are going to move in. So the more weed competition there's going to be. So really having eyes on that planting, not just planting it and walking away and thinking it's going to be successful. So creating a zone for your garden. So if you've got a larger space or you have lots of little gardens, designate each of them as a zone and then give each of them weekly attention or monthly attention. It makes it a little bit more, a little easier to manage. It's not so overwhelming. While you're weeding, minimize soil disruption. And I'm going to contradict myself and say that sometimes soil disruption can be beneficial. But overall, if you have an annual weed that's going to seed, don't be ripping it out at the same time you're disturbing the soil and shaking those seeds around. That's going to really, you're just going to be, creating more work for yourself. Because you're just adding to that seed bank. So really the idea is within those first few seasons of growth is to minimize that seed bank that's in that planting. That said, while you are disturbing your soil, if you're not concerned about, adding more weed seeds to your planting, if you have a little satchel full of partridge pea seed or blue grama seed or something like that, you can add those seeds to that planting and use that disturbance to your benefit. So you can actually be planting seeds as you're in there disturbing things. Overall, is consistency and patience, and you really need to be more stubborn than the weed, which is, can be really hard sometimes, especially for larger areas. People get really frustrated with like large areas, and that's when it does get difficult. So, but just keeping up with it. Fall, spring cleanup, and I hesitate to even use the word cleanup because really, we're emulating natural cycles. We want to just recreate what nature does naturally. However, we can't set our yards on fire necessarily. So the best thing we can do is to either mow periodically or cut things back. So what we do is once a year, either like late spring or early fall, we'll do a cut and drop where we kind of just like cut the material down either with head shears or things like that, and just kind of like let it drop back into the garden as mulch. We wait until insects are emerging later in the spring, so waiting until temperatures are really nice and warm, which this year's been really hard for people, I think, to really wait and just see. But those insects, they know it's not time to come out yet, and even things like salamanders and toads and things like that, they're not coming out yet. So really having that patience and waiting. There's other things you can do. You can go into your park and clean up the trash in your park. You can go check out the storm drains in your neighborhood and clean those storm drains out. There's other things you can do. You can remove buckthorn, all sorts of things. Fall leaf management, that's another thing. I like that term, management, rather than cleanup. My rule of thumb is whatever kind of naturally lands in the garden on its own from the trees around it, for the most part, is perfect. That's kind of the sweet spot. Because if you're in a forest or natural area, your plants have evolved to yeah, I need my, oh, it's in that satchel right there, Jeremy. That's a black one. Yeah, there you go. My battery is low here. Yeah, so the leaf material that builds up naturally is kind of where it's at. So what happens is if you do have a buildup of that extra material, you can sort of in a timely manner rake that into a leaf holding area somewhere. And again, schedule for pollinators and then be patient. This is a pretty, I give this to all my clients, leave the leaves, let the stem stand, keep material on site. It's pretty straightforward there. So these are some examples of like what leaving the leaves looks like. So this is after we've actually gone through and already cleaned this garden up. So there's lots of leaf litter already there. There's a little miniature rain garden here that's been actually raked out because we do want to remove leaves out of there. So that stays nice and low and not filled in. We've got stems cut at different heights here. There's still leaves crowded around the base of these things that's going to be held in by these stems. So there's lots of opportunity for insects to kind of still be there. Here's a boulevard planting. This is my garden. So what I make sure to do is to make sure that this edge along the street and this sidewalk edge is nice and tidy. It's not hanging over. There's not going to be material that's going to catch a bunch of snow and ice and freeze and be a big mess for people. It's also good not to have things going into the street here from a water quality standpoint as well. So, and then there's also lots of material left standing up. So we've even got cedar for the birds over the winter. This is a backyard prairie. So this is, we've got our eco grass path here. What we did was we did mow the sides of this just to widen it out a little bit. So if the snow does, bring anything down, it's going to land not on our path. So we still have access for the winter. And then we did cut this main part down, by about a third, I'd say. And we may come back late spring and depending on how things are looking and cut it back even more. If this material starts to really build up heavily to a thick thatch, then we would probably periodically, once every 3 to 5 years or something, remove that physically. But mostly this stuff will break down right back into the soil and it'll become really rich soil. So I talked a little bit about leaf management. So the client has a front yard with a couple oaks that hold their leaves for a long time, and they were getting frustrated because they all of a sudden dropped the leaves and then they're just sitting there all winter. So rather than mulching those leaves or anything like that, we just rake them up, throw them in this bin. They can break down. Before you know it, you got nice rich compost there for your garden. So we'll talk about types of native gardens. So we've got kind of, larger scale, maybe habitat restoration projects that you're going to see, more in natural areas, naturalistic plantings that can be part of your smaller landscape, more sort of formal or cottage residential gardens, rain gardens, and then meadows and bee lawns. And these are, again, they're designed plant communities. So, these aren't going to probably be plant pairings you're going to see in nature necessarily, but if they fit the site, then that's, and they complement each other, then that's kind of the goal. So as far as like natural plant communities, recreating those, we can try, but once an actual remnant plant community is gone in nature, it's gone forever. You can't really bring it back without basically making it into another design plant community. So a naturalistic planting, lots of grasses. There's not really any, things can be more dotted in. There's not going to be much structure to it, but it's, it's again trying to recreate a natural look. This is again my boulevard, so you can see there's a little structure. There's kind of some planting and drifts happening, but every year that goes by, things become a little bit more mixed. So it's definitely becoming more naturalized. This is a really great plant I like for those boulevards. It's called purple poppy mallow. Really drought tolerant. The bees love the blooms. It's a low growing ground cover, so it's really great with erosion, powers through some really tough conditions. Really nice boulevard of ours in North Minneapolis that we've got wild petunia here, blanket flower, native blanket flower. I'll talk a little bit about blanket flower later, I think, if I can get to it. But the main thing with blanket flower is it needs disturbance. It's a short-lived pioneer species. It's not going to live very long. A lot of people get frustrated because they'll buy a blanket flower from the nursery and it dies 2 years later and never comes back. These need to be kind of propagated. Like you gotta kind of rough that soil up a little bit, spread those seeds, not weed out those seedlings, learn to identify those seedlings, and then you'll have blanket flower coming back forever. So really great boulevard plant, very tough. And again, these are areas that are really prone to disturbance. So so those areas that are getting roughed up, those seeds can really take advantage of that. So we'll talk a little bit about soft landings. So this is a soft landing in my yard. So a soft landing is basically a garden that we're planting under a native tree. So we've got native trees that are, like an oak is considered what we call a keystone species. Keystone species has a ton of wildlife value. It's hosting a lot of insect life. It's probably hosting a few species of Lepidoptera, which are those moths and butterflies. So when those insects are in the canopy of the tree, feeding on the leaves and, getting nice and fat and wanting to go on to their next stage of life, they got to crawl down that tree or drop down sometimes by stringers, and they need somewhere safe to land. Now, if your tree is surrounded by lawn that's being aggressively mowed every week and the soil is compacted and there's nowhere for those insects to go, or it's got landscape fabric and rock under it, those insects aren't going to have a very high success rate. So this idea of a soft landing garden, it gives these insects a safe place to go. And the cool thing about it is that you can also plant that with more native plants. So you get even more host plants under your host tree. So you're really starting to fully emulate that idea of a natural cycle. This graphic was put together by Heather Holm and Leslie Pilgrim of Neighborhood Greening, and Wild Ones, I believe at the information table has this available with the keystone species aspect too. So really important to keep in mind there. So cottage gardens, so kind of more, just like a foundation planting, is a garden you're going to live around, something that's going to be, in your living space, bringing nature closer to you. So, there's some nice textures here, especially I talk about green being a color, really great textures here. The garden is full. You don't see dots of plants in a mulch pile. So you really got to think about, that is going to be a higher maintenance landscape than something like this, where everything's growing together and out competing those weeds. Your weeds are really just whatever plants are in here that want to move around a little bit. And that's kind of an, easier thing to manage. And plus, then instead of giving daylilies to your neighbor, you could give spiderwort to your neighbor. So, and again, these areas that are higher trafficked are a little bit more tidy and they're a little bit more approachable and a little bit more structured. Another one where we're using some shorter grasses as a border. And again, those blanket flowers in here with some Joe Pye, some echinacea, a little bit more sort of organized. Rain gardens. So we've been doing quite a few more rain gardens. And I think a lot of people get a little bit overwhelmed with the idea of a rain garden. They're really kind of like stupid simple. It's just a low area where water is going to collect. It's like water wants to go to the lowest point. As long as you're not routing water into your basement or routing water into a neighbor's property or making a problem, as long as you're thinking intelligently about where you're putting these things, they're going to work really well for you. They really allow us during these drought periods to embrace planting some plants that we might not get away with otherwise, because they're a little bit more resilient. They're going to be soft. They're going to be slower to dry out. They're going to hold moisture longer. So we can plant some of those more fun, kind of things that we can't do in a really droughty garden. So you're really just playing with topography here. So this is a larger one in Bloomington that we did. Is just catching runoff from the roof that kind of percolates down the lawn into this kind of basin here. This is like a micro rain garden. So this is again in North Minneapolis, right off a sidewalk between two homes. It's maybe 5 feet long and maybe like, I don't know, it might be 8 inches, 9 inches deep. So not very big, but it's between two properties. So you've got a downspout here, a downspout here, and it's just kind of right in there. And we've got cardinal flower, we've got echinacea, swamp milkweed. You see monarch butterflies in there. It's a good thing. But this catchment area isn't huge. This is not a ton of water coming out of these two little downspouts, but it's enough just to kind of feed this rain garden. And in the winter, it keeps these sidewalks free of ice, which is really, really nice. Another little one here. It looks closer to this foundation than it really is. The photo's a little misleading, but this does route water safely away from the foundation. That was definitely a consideration. And the grade of this home, any overflow that would occur in here is definitely going to be going down into the grass, which is, good for your grass too. So, and then this is one that's in the corner of a backyard, just catching some of that low kind of seepage. Utilizing other features. So without being an actual rain garden, we can think about like berms and swales and how we can kind of naturally route water into low areas. So this is an area at Jefferson High School. I worked with Earth Corps there to design and install. It's kind of a rain garden. It's more of just kind of like a swale, but there was a naturally occurring low area in this lawn that was not doing anything. So we just tore up the grass and dropped a bunch of mulch in there and planted it with these beautiful plants that were supplied by, I think they were Natural Shore Technologies is who grew these plants for us. So, but it's this nice little kind of, you can meander through the little middle path there, and the butterflies came right away. So it was amazing to see the amount of insects that just came flocking to this little oasis right off the school there. So, so we'll move into bee lawns and meadow lawns. This is, so I guess I'll talk about kind of the definition of that, because I think some people get a little bit confused. Anything that's like, for me, it's anything that's like under 2 feet, right? So we're taking the place of a traditional lawn, a turf lawn. We want it to be resilient for drought. We want it to be sort of, aesthetically kind of negative space for the property. But diverse, right? Because we want there to be some host plants for things in here. We want there to be forage for bees. So these are some examples of, some ideas for bee lawns or meadow lawns. Robin's plantain is in the fleabane family. And I should say too, a lot of the plants that I have in this presentation are plants that I really want people to ask for from their growers. They're not commonly available, but I think if we start asking our growers for these things, it'll make me happy because I'll have more available for my practice. And also you guys will get some really cool stuff too. But they function beautifully in home landscapes, but they're just not available because they're not commonly used in Minnesota, at least. So, but Robin's plantain, awesome meadow plant, or, meadow lawn plant, bee lawn plant. It grows like a ground cover, almost like bugleweed kind of does. So real low sprawling. And then it gets these awesome daisies that are like pretty good size. Like this is our native daisy, So pretty good size. It's blooming in that kind of weird, awkward time in late spring when there's maybe not so many blooms either. So really good plant. So this is I don't know if it's a bee lawn or a meadow lawn, or if it's a lazy lawn is what this is. This is my lazy lawn. We just kind of stopped mowing and we just stopped working on it. But what we did do was we weeded. So we just weeded it. We watched what was kind of coming up. This is that soft landing garden here. And, you know, the phlox just kind of started moving in. And I was like, it was this spring actually that I really noticed it. And I was like, this is beautiful. Like it was just this like beautiful glowing blue color every morning. And I thought, you know, phlox is turning into a really great bee lawn plant or meadow lawn plant. So, so we're fully, you know, endorsing phlox as a lawn alternative plant. Our Bloomington soil is very sandy. It dries very quickly. It drains very fast. So those plants need to be pretty tough to handle that. So a lot of times it can just be kind of like letting your lawn go back to what nature wants it to be, but we have to keep an eye on it. We have to make sure that it's the right things growing in there and kind of give it a guiding hand. So this is actually like an actual native bee lawn mix install that we did. So this was starting from almost a blank slate. There was some fescue and some bluegrass that we left that was healthy-ish looking. But then we overseeded with the Twin City Seed native bee lawn mix. So there's no white clover in here. There's no Dutch white clover. This is just the self-heal, yarrow. And I think we did throw some violet seed in here too. So this is the first season, so there's not much bloom, but you can see the yarrow is just starting to come up in here. And yarrow is probably my favorite lawn alternative plant because it mows beautifully. If it gets regular mowing, it gets even kind of mossier and fuller. So really great plant for bee lawns. And again, this was the other kind of surprise in my lawn. So this fall, after, you know, I had the spring with the woodland phlox, this fall, I've got asters coming up everywhere. And then these just blew in from the park. There's heath aster or some sort of white aster in the park. And they just blew in. And I kind of woke up and looked out the window one morning and saw them. And I was like, that's pretty sweet. You know, they got mowed once. They got mowed once this summer. We mowed our lawn one time. And they came back shorter. Like when you think about like pinching mums back, right? So you pinch mums back and they get a more kind of floriferous bloom on them. The same thing happened with these. So it was a really nice surprise to just kind of come out and realize that things were just kind of happening that were beautiful. And I didn't really have to do anything other than make sure that they were allowed to do it there. So these are some good bee lawn species that I recommend. So these first 4 are in that Twin City Seed mix that you can buy from like Bachman's or other areas too. Native asters, again, you know, as long as they're not a real thick stem, I don't know that I would do like New England aster or anything like that, but shorter, the finer stems, they'll mow kind of nicely, so they'll stay a little shorter. Pennsylvania sedge is a really good sedge. Our lake home up north in Alexandria, there's Pennsylvania sedge everywhere, and it's awesome, and it never turns brown. And then ecograss or Nomo blends fescue, so those are things you can buy from Prairie Moon as well. And violets. So violets are probably free in your garden. So if you have violets and you don't like them, I really think you should change your mind on that. So they're free. They're a free thing that you have. They're never going to turn brown. They're going to live through any drought. That's a general statement, but they're going to live through a lot. And they're host plants for Lepidoptera. So they're actually growing moths and butterflies for you. So, and they're early season forage for bees. Like there's so many good things about violets. So they're a really good thing. So now we'll get into site prep here. So we'll talk about smothering or sheet mulching or lasagna method, we call it sometimes, solarizing and traditional sod removal, which is the not so fun one, but we'll talk about it anyways. In probably 90% of the projects that we do, we actually do sheet mulching, and I like it for a few different reasons. It builds soil really well. It really helps lock in resilience and moisture to those sites. It lets me kind of move around a little bit more, so I can set up one project and then we can do another one. And by the time that one's done, we can go back and plant the first one. So it's a really good way for us to kind of multitask, things like that. But really the results are amazing. So all of my gardens at our property were done by sheet mulching. So what we do, and this project has a couple different applications. So we've done on the boulevard like traditional sod removal because we couldn't build the grade up. We wanted the grade to be lower than the curb. But on the grassy areas here, we did sheet mulching. So you literally just lay down cardboard, and then you lay down a bunch of mulch over that. Make sure, you know, this could be a little dicey, so make sure your mulch isn't gonna run off, you know, onto a sidewalk. So we monitored this and made sure that that mulch was, you know, enmeshing really well and not eroding. And then, you know, the plants go in after all of that grass and all that cardboard has decayed. So hopefully we get some rain and that helps with that process. If not, I've actually had to have people go water their mulch yard. to make sure that decomposition process does happen. Once it does, then we can plant into it. And then after one season, you'll start seeing things really bulking out. So, and growing beautifully. So it really does work.
And
Yes.
I want to interrupt you
Yeah.
one second. Somebody asked earlier about mulch and PFAs. Do you have anything to say on cardboard?
All I can say is source your cardboard as clean as you can. So we do uncoated cardboard. The less printing, the better. Nothing with any shiny stuff on it, no tape. Can I guarantee that cardboard doesn't have anything in it? No, but that's a process that's worked for us so far. If a client had concerns, we would definitely address those concerns. But we also use builder's paper a lot too. So builder's paper is a natural craft paper product as well. So, yeah, so then this is, I think, second season of this garden. So things are starting to really fill in nicely. Another project we did, this was a little bit more of a slope hill here, but exact same process, just covered it with paper, covered it with a bunch of mulch, kept the chicken. We learned quickly to keep the chickens out of there because they were a disaster. But so fence the chickens out of there because they will scratch everything up. But within 1 year, you've got a beautiful garden. It's just amazing how fast things really do grow and fill in. So once that soil gets really kind of equalized a bit. So this is a project where we solarized. So we actually used plastic. And the reason we wanted to solarize was because we're seeding this. You can't seed into a sheet mulching project because there's nothing for the seed to catch onto. You really need bare soil for that. So we solarized this yard for an entire year. So this sat like this for a year. We lifted it up in July, let it sit for a week, and it rained, and then things sprouted. We put the plastic back down and killed it and let it go until that fall again. So you're really depleting that seed bank in there. And there was also quite a bit of creeping Charlie in this yard too. Any surviving creeping Charlie really got hit over the head again when we put that plastic back over it. So it really did work. You're in it for the long haul. It's a whole season of prep. But then what we do is we will sow that in the winter. So this was, I think, like January or February, we went out and sowed the seed. We covered it with a layer of some pine straw here, just to keep it from blowing away, maybe keep the birds away from eating it. And then this is what it looked like in the spring. So you can see things are starting to already come up. We put an eco-grass path through here. And this was late spring. So things were already, those pioneer species, the Rudbeckias and things like that were already starting to come up. So successful seeding. So the first season, then things are looking really beautiful, and then you need to mow it. So the most painful thing to do is to have to go through, and you can time it so you can mow it before it's really full of bloom. But you got to mow it at least twice that first season. What that does is it knocks down those pioneer species that are really fast to grow. They're going to be hogging all of the sunlight, all the nutrients from those slower growing species that are really focusing on root growth. So it equalizes the playing field to make sure your planting is more successful. So this is the regrowth after we mowed it. So you can see we didn't kill anything. It all came back perfectly fine. And then this is what it grew into, later in that season. So sod removal. So this is, again, like the not fun one, but sometimes it makes sense to do it, especially if we're thinking about keeping a grade lower than a curb, or rain gardens. Obviously we need to remove the sod, so we do it sometimes, and it's not super fun, but it is what it is. Rain garden preparation. So if you need any help kind of like planning or things like that, you can hire us to do it, or you can go to Blue Thumb, and they have really good rain garden guides on there, and that'll help you like calculate the catchment, things like that. So like how much is this rain garden needing? How large is this rain garden needing to be to catch this section of roof, of water output? So yeah.
Are there boulevard restrictions on rain gardens at all?
On rain gardens, likely. So you'd probably want to contact, whatever city you're in to make sure. So yeah, because the rain garden is a little bit more involved than just putting some blanket flower in. So now we'll talk a little bit about garden planning and design. Before you start, kind of ask yourself some questions, just like you would like a home renovation. Like, how is your space used? Are there problem areas? Do you have bad soil in areas where things are just not living? Are there areas where water is building up where you want to reroute that water into maybe a rain garden in the corner or something? What are your maintenance abilities? Again, you don't want to bite off more than you can chew with the planting. It's really fun to think about like my whole front yard being a meadow or being a prairie, but for it to be successful and for it to really put what we're doing in a good light, we want to make sure that it's being maintained. So either you can physically do it and you have the capability of doing that, or you have the means to pay a service to do that for you. If you have pets, you might want to consider that. So pets can sometimes be destructive on planting, so that's something to keep in mind as well. So evaluating your space, soil structure, really looking at your soil. Do you have clay soil? Do you have sandy soil, or are you somewhere in between? Your light conditions, actually going out into your yard during different parts of the day and observing. Sometimes there will be like a funky architectural aspect of your home that's funneling light in a really weird way. That can be beneficial, or it could fry a plant out, So there's all sorts of little nuances there that might be, if you can kind of figure that out on the front end, it can save you some time. Again, weeds and invasive species, so really looking hard at what you've already got going on, and then stormwater issues. So wherever we can get stormwater back into the ground before it goes into a storm sewer, that's what we want to aim for. We want to get that water back into the system, into the ground. So some design tips. So planting in drifts. So like I say, a wild prairie can be kind of a chaotic place. It can be something where there's kind of one of everything in there. So if we initially plant our plantings in drifts, it gives a little bit more organization. It's a little more legible. It's more approachable as well. Over time, those plants are going to move around a little bit anyways. So understanding your plant height and spacing. So taller stuff in the middle or towards the back and shorter stuff on the edges. Limit your palette, which is really hard because you like all the things, right? You go to the plant sale and you want to get one of everything. Really limiting yourself can be helpful in that it's easier to maintain. If you're going in there and weeding, you're not having to like differentiate between like 5 to 10 different things if you just have 3 things planted in that small space. So maybe not as fun, but it can be helpful in the long run. Embracing texture, like I talked about before, there might be lulls in your color palette during the season if things aren't blooming at the same time, but really thinking about leaf shape and leaf texture can be really helpful. Right plant in the right place, so not forcing things where they don't belong, making sure we're really picking out the plants that should be there. You're going to have a lot more success. And something I've been really pushing lately is get a soil test. So contact the University of Minnesota. They have a soil lab. You can order a kit, and they will do soil tests for you. It can be really telling if you have a lawn that you're converting. Lawns are usually pretty high on some things that won't really be very amenable to planting. So we'll kind of zoom through some. Yeah, we have time, right?
5 minutes.
Oh.
We should allow some time.
Okay. Should we just go quickly through these then, or okay? So wild petunia, full sun, dry boulevard, blanket flower. We talked about that one. Purple prairie clover. If you're having salt issues, purple prairie clover is a really good one for salty boulevards. Prairie shooting star. Don't buy tulips. Buy some of these. Tall bellflower, biennial, woodland, shade, very drought tolerant, really good for pollinators. Buy sedges. All I can say about this one is just buy some sedge. So, and then this is another free one, Virginia waterleaf. You probably already have that in your garden. So definitely, if you have that, keep it. It's a good one. Yeah, so we'll do questions now. Thank you guys for all of your attention. So. Anybody? Yep, go ahead.
Climate change and
Yep.
we're now in level 5. There's all these things that are probably native to zone 5, the ones native to here, but they start moving in.
Yeah. I think so I think it was Benjamin Vo, that author that I mentioned. He actually has a landscape company too. I shouldn't say he's just an author. He's also a landscaper, very successful landscaper and designer. One thing I learned from him is that we got to stop thinking in zones. We got to look at geography, right? So, where, right. And I think it's, I know that especially with forestry, a lot of trees that are not equipped to handle this heat are gonna be struggling. And so I know in forestry for sure, we're starting to plant things that are more southern oriented, a little further north. And I think that's, it gets into kind of the weeds a little bit, depending on, certain things. So I'd say, if it feels like a good geographically get here by foot, that's kind of how I view it. So if someone could bring it here by foot, that's kind of where I am. So, yeah. Oh,
So we can see your face up there.
aha, got it.
You
Okay.
have over 50 people in your home.
There we
audience.
go. Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the question was basically, how we're handling, with the changing weather, moving things that are native adjacent to Minnesota into our growing area. So, hopefully that makes sense. Yeah, go ahead.
When you do cardboard under the mulch, how
Mhm.
long do you let that sit before you start collecting?
Okay, so the question is, when we do the sheet mulching, how long do we let the cardboard sit? Again, it depends on how much moisture we have going on. It also depends on how many weeds are in there. Sometimes that sheet mulching will take care of 90% of the problem unless you have quack grass. Quack grass will, kind of come back up. So we'll do kind of repeat visits. If you're getting regular moisture, at least a good month. At least a good month. But the best thing to do is kind of check and see. And if decomposition is happening down there, then you're good to go. The one caveat I'd say, or one thing to keep in mind is, with the sheet mulching, you got to plant a little bit bigger plant stock, because what happens is you have these teeny little plugs from Prairie Moon or Prairie Restorations or something. Those teeny little plugs, if you have a lot of that mulch, they'll get kind of choked out. So we typically go with slightly larger plant stock for those sheet mulching projects. So, does that answer your question?
So Andy, we're
Yes.
gonna take some questions from home too. So we're gonna alternate a hand in the audience and a hand at home.
Sounds good.
A couple of the first questions that came in at home were, do you help install barrels as well as rain gardens? And where do you buy those books locally so you don't have to go to Amazon?
Oh, yeah, I'll install a rain barrel. Why not? I actually bought 2 rain barrels that I need to install for myself. Oh, sorry. Yeah. The question is, will I install rain barrels? Yes, I will install rain barrels. And where can you purchase those books? You can purchase them directly from the authors themselves by going to their websites. I know Heather has her own website. Benjamin has his own site, and the Doug Tallamy Hub has their stuff for sale. Does Wild Ones, do we still sell books?
We will actually have some books that are in our collection of storage on a half price sale
There we go.
on May 24th at our resource fair.
We also
I'm not
have,
sure which-
we have a library too, don't we? That people can, if members can.
I'm gonna get that. Okay. So we have a library, but we don't have a librarian.
Oh, so this is a call for a librarian.
So for a number of years,
Going out.
for a number of years, the librarian would bring the books, people would check them out, and then they bring them back to meetings. And so
We
still have the
we need
suitcase.
to fill that role.
we still have the suitcase with
Yes.
the library books.
Yeah.
So if there's a book you need, we can help you find it.
The Minnesota Landscape Arboretum is a lot too.
Excellent. So now we'll do a question from the group here, if anybody has one.
Well, we have more from home.
Okay.
We already talked about the PSAs. How do I protect my monarch cats from wasps?
Let nature handle it, I think. Just let nature, plant more milkweed. The more milkweed you have, the more monarchs you have. So I think that's the easy answer. So nature's got to find that balance. And yeah, so the question was how to protect monarch caterpillars from predation from wasps. And it really is just planting more milkweed, having a healthy ecosystem that can give them the best chance that they can get. So, but I'm not an entomologist, so I'm not a bug expert necessarily.
Somebody asked you what type of mulch
What type of mulch do we use? Just double shredded hardwood mulch, nothing dyed, nothing colored, just double shredded hardwood mulch. A lot of times you can get mulch drops from tree companies. So if you call up a local company and need a bunch of mulch for a big project, they will dump it right in your driveway. They probably won't tell you when or necessarily where they'll do it, but they will do it. And then, you know, you can, yeah, it might not be double shredded. Yeah, that probably will be a little rougher, but it also does work. You know, the wood chip stuff, I've used it. It takes longer to break down. But it does work. But yeah, if you're gonna purchase it, just double shredded hardwood mulch, try to get them to scoop it off the top of the pile rather than the bottom of the pile. You can get better stuff that way. Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about when to do a lot of planting?
Sure. So timing, when to do a lot of plantings. Any time is better than no time. Fall is really a great time. It's cooler. If you get those plants in 2-3 weeks before frost and mulch them really good, they're going to be growing roots when the weather's really cool. So you actually get like a little bit of a bonus growing season if you do fall planting. Fall planting is a really good time. You can do it in the middle of July when it's 100 degrees, but you're going to have a higher failure rate of plants, and you're going to be out there watering a lot. So anytime is fine. If you're going to be sowing seed, you need to know what your germination code is for those seeds, because a lot of them need to go through a complete winter to stratify, or at least a couple weeks of cold temperatures to stratify. So, so we winter seeded that project so those seeds can stratify. Yep.
So somebody, I believe it was Deb, planted a full backyard garden in 2022, and then in 2023, the bunnies ate it all.
So never heard of that. Never heard of that. Yeah. So rabbits and deer. They're getting worse with the drought. We noticed last year was a very frustrating year for rabbits. Especially when they don't have a lot of stuff to eat out there, and we install, 300 juicy, delicate, really delicious little sprouts of plants. They go in and just mow it down. So you just have to protect them. So caging them, fencing them, it looks awful. It's not fun to do. It's aesthetically a nightmare for me. It triggers me, but caging is part of it. There's repellent you can put down. Repelzol is a decent repellent, but it's hit or miss. What was that? Scram. Someone said scram. Jeremy said scram. So also, there are certain plants that do better. So any plant that's kind of prickly or real furry, fuzzy, those tend to be a little bit less palatable. And then alliums and mints typically are a little bit less desirable, but don't put it past them. You may think of plants rabbit proof, but it doesn't mean anything. They'll try it. So
Okay, Emily says that those paver stone walks, how do you keep them from sinking? I have very peaty soil, so it's always moving things up, concrete or down. Also concrete, but also my paver stone.
yeah, so if you have clay soil too, can be kind of tricky for that, especially if the drainage is bad. Base, you got to, it's just kind of over engineering it. Paver base underneath, a couple inches of paver base is going to be your best bet. So just gotta build in that engineering. Unfortunately, it's more work, but it will last longer for you. Because yeah, they're going to want to sink, or like you say, when it swells, they're going to be popping out. So.
Let's see. The next question here, Aaron says, how do you tell the difference between creeping bellflower and the tall bellflower?
We caught that. We zoomed through that bellflower slide so fast. I didn't think anybody would catch that. Minnesota wildflowers.info. Go on minnesotawildflowers.info and you can identify them. They are related. So bellflower, campanula gets a really bad rap because creeping bellflower is an awful, awful plant. I mean, it's not, there's no bad plant, right? But it's awful here. I get in trouble with that with my workers a lot. I demonize organisms because we get frustrated. Creeping bellflower is a big problem. The nice thing about our native bellflowers, so we also have harebell, Campanula rotundifolia. They don't creep. They don't run. They're not invasive. So harebell is a beautiful, delicate, rocky outcropping, plant. Tall bellflower is this really cool, tough, drought tolerant, shady woodland plant. It can handle moisture and drought, all those kind of things in between. So identifying them on Minnesota Wildflowers info, they don't really look similar. The flower structure is completely different. Tall bellflower has this really cool star shaped, like open star shape to it that grows on a stalk. So they look much different.
Some of the at-home audience have been replying about how you can go to like Prairie Resto and go out to some of our nurseries that have showrooms. They have a lot of the books available. I know
Okay.
Prairie Resto up in Scandia
They
is
have
a really great
They have a whole shop. Yeah,
shop.
it's very, very cool.
So we have a couple of questions here, getting back to mulch.
Yep.
And jumping worms.
Julia, you're the authority on that. Specifically, anything, how to avoid jumping worms in mulch? Is that kind of the question?
Yeah, how do you, where do you resource? How do you avoid it? Do you use any of the public sites?
Just like I would do if I was buying plant material that I wanted to make sure didn't have systemic insecticides. So if you ask your mulch supplier, if you're buying it, if they know about jumping worms or what they're doing about jumping worms, and if they don't have a good answer, probably that's pretty telling. So I know that if you're sourcing locally, I have had conversations with the mulch store in Burnsville. They have an info sheet they send their clients. They do the best they can. Obviously, these are very tricky organisms, very resourceful organisms. So there's no 100% foolproof sort of thing. But just knowing that they have staff there that's familiar and monitoring is a huge thing. Also, I know Heidi's Grow House, they source their materials with jumping worms, in mind as far as keeping things clean in that way. So having that conversation with your supplier is huge. Fresh mulch, like I say, if you're getting a tree drop, a tree company dropping mulch or things like that, there's very little chance, I feel like, that's going to be an issue. Would you agree with that? Like,
the only thing about a chip drop is whether or not they rake the debris from the ground, dump it into the load.
Sure.
Anytime you add anything to your garden, whether it be soil, mulch, plants from somebody else, your best defense is to be really observant in the first 60 to 90 days.
Yeah.
Because if you have introduced something like a jumping worm, you're going to know about it in the first 60 to 90 days. So you just need to really monitor those areas.
Yeah. It's just a matter of, being vigilant and, doing what you can. So, yeah.
So the city of Bloomington is a little bit concerned about, and actually statewide, they're concerned about the increase in ticks.
Sure. Yeah, I think the tick issue, I'm not an entomologist, I'm not an insect expert. They're tied, my understanding is they're tied mainly to rodents. So you got to kind of watch the rodent population. I'm trying to think. I know that I think climate change is a big part of this too. So, I don't know that, I'm not an expert. I can't guarantee that native plants aren't, don't need to be part of that conversation, but I don't know that planting, having more natural areas is necessarily an issue. But I would say that the tick issue is really a symptom of, again, that balance. So, but I know that rodent population in response to when trees put out a lot of nuts, things like that. Japanese barberry has been shown to be sort of a vector for ticks, and that rodents are eating the berries, and they're kind of hanging out on Japanese barberry. So there's lots of different things at play there. So
so the only other questions from home was back to mulch about diseases being spread like Astor's yellow or others.
Yeah.
And I think I can answer that. If you're processing the mulch or the soil in a way that is protecting you from jumping worms, they're also protecting it from pathogens.
Hygiene is hygiene. And like I say, if you're going to the municipal mulch pile, like I think I said, get it off the top. Don't be scooping it in that soupy, gross, old stuff. It's tempting because it looks like it's going to be really good for your garden, right? Because it's all decayed and stuff, but there's probably stuff in there you don't want in your garden. So, the thing is, if you're getting it off the top and if you're monitoring for things really well, and it looks like it's, pretty clean, there's no guarantees, right? This is nature. So, but we can try it the best we can. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
So I watch for 60 to 90 days, my lawn is sleeping.
Yeah.
Jumping worms are a whole nother presentation. But
Yeah,
I will
yeah.
tell you, if you come here in May to our resource fair, as long as I can find enough volunteers to be doing other things, I'll be tabling on how to identify your traditional European worms. And European worms are also not native. So
But
once
they're-
you start to learn to identify your European worms and learn the difference between the life cycles, then you become your best offense in terms of identifying and looking for the activity. And if you catch them in the first 90 days after they hatch, before they get that white patellum on them, they can't reproduce.
Mhm.
So that's why it's really that 60 to 90-day monitoring. If cocoons have arrived in that soil and the conditions are right, they're gonna hatch. And then in 60 to 90 days, they'll start reproducing. So that
Yeah.
30 to 60-day marker is when you start just looking to see if there's anything different. And if you're learning how to identify earthworms that you've had in your garden, start looking and handling them and touching them and hitting them with a stick, then all of a sudden you'll say, this is different, and
Yeah.
you'll start to know.
And we've seen, we've been at garden sites where, one of my workers will be like, oh, I think there's one here, but if you spend enough time with them, you learn to identify them. And it's something that we need to be aware of, but I think panic, not necessarily we won't like panic about it either. So, but again, just detecting them early and yeah, keeping an eye out is good.
So there's only two more things from home.
Sure.
One is if there's any systemic insecticide in mulch left over from the EAB treatment.
Mhm.
And the other is, what do you do about spreading burdock?
Spreading burdock. Okay. Systemic pesticides in ash trees, I would assume there probably is in there. So again, asking, was this ash tree? And then, ash trees are being removed, everywhere right now. So chances are, if you're getting it from, your municipal mulch supplier, there probably is ash in there. So I don't know necessarily, if that's going to be a high enough concentration to, get into the soil and then get uptaken, be uptaken by plants potentially. My hope, again, I'm not a chemist. I'm not a chemist, so I can't say, but I think there's lots of opportunity for us to learn more about this. So learning really what the half-life of these chemicals are and what the implications of them are. The other question, so again, asking your supplier, do you know what kind of wood this is? Where would it come from? Burdock, so how to manage burdock. Get that taproot out first deep, get the seeds out of there, bag them up. Don't let them, they're going to want to stick to everything. So just be careful about getting the seeds. They're a pain to deal with, and they like to spread in groves, but they're growing by a taproot. You got to just dig that taproot out, get a root cutting shovel or something, a post shovel, get that taproot out, because it will come back if you don't get that taproot out. So, and then just coming back, repeated visits. So, yeah, but how do you get rid of thistle? It's a tough one. So, what we don't do is I don't use herbicide. I've seen herbicide backfire horribly, specifically at a site in Blaine that we work at, and it's a large site. We didn't spray it, another company sprayed it. It killed everything except for the thistle. The milkweed died, everything else died. So I haven't had good luck with herbicide, but I feel like maybe if you timed it right, it could be helpful along with hand pulling. Something that I'm going to be looking into is it's a vine and stump killer. So it's like it's a product called Sucker Punch, where you apply that to what it is it gets in. It's like if you have suckers coming from a tree you're trying to get rid of, you would apply that onto those suckers and it kills the whole thing. So that's something that potentially we might look into. I don't like to use any herbicides if I don't have to, but in some cases the thistle can really be soul crushing. Like you think you get it under control and then you leave it for a few weeks and then it just comes back with a vengeance. So regular hand pulling is the thing that we kind of do. So just hand pull. Maybe there's an herbicidal aspect, a very, very, very targeted, very careful, very responsible herbicide, application. So not broadcast spraying or anything like that.
So thank you. I don't see any, are there any other questions from the group? I want to thank
Yeah.
Andy.
Oh, yeah.
European creeping bellflower, what's your thoughts about pulling it as soon as it starts to come up?
Yeah.
Every time.
Yeah, so managing creeping bellflower by repeated pulling, trying to exhaust that tuber.
Yeah.
Bellflower has actually a really delicious edible starchy tuber, if you're on a chemical-free site, but since it's so starchy, that means it has a ton of energy that it can just keep putting it out there. But of course, if you were out there every day or every 3 days for an entire season, you might be able to make some leeway. And that's something that we for sure do a little bit of that, like digging it out is kind of the main thing, and then just follow up weeding. So it's possible, but there's a lot of energy in those tubers that can keep them back.
So one of the at-home audience was saying, just continue starving, like cut,
Yep.
cut. And that's kind of my method of a lot of those things is,
Yeah.
they need photosynthesis to kind of recharge. So if you just sever, you're reducing that soil
Yep.
disturbance. So anyway, I'm Julia, by the way. I've been monitoring the at-home audience, and Jeremy and Susan had the lead on here. We want to thank Andy for coming here tonight. For all of them that are here, there is over 50 people in our at-home Zoom audience, and not one complained about being able to hear you. So we had a successful hybrid meeting,
That's
which is something that we work so hard for, but we can never guarantee it. And that's why we come early and do all this setup. So thank you all for coming. Just again, a show of hands of newcomers here tonight. I think it is absolutely awesome that you're here. We hope to see you at upcoming meetings. And anyone who wants to help out with the Native Plant Resource Fair on May 21st, you can see me, or there is going to be a newsletter that we're working on. We're trying to get back to having a quarterly newsletter. Again, we need an editor, but we're trying to get back to telling everybody about all the chapter activities going on and all the chapter news, things that are going behind the scenes at the board meeting and everything else, so that you can learn how you can become more involved. Andy is a member of our board, by the way. Could we have the other board members please stand up who are here tonight?